threesome with your two girlfriends every day. That's polygamy, and we're going to tear its wild history wide open, revealing ancient societies where only old guys could have two wives, and talk about modern societies where still you can have 15 women, but you have to share them with the whole village. Plot twist: you pay all the alimony. If right now you're thinking two girlfriends sounds fun and games, you might just rethink it by the end of this video. Because double the fun means double the trouble. So, let's begin already, because your wife is probably already waiting for you to take the trash out, but you promised you'd watch one more video. Polygamy, the practice of having more than one spouse at a time, has been a common habit in many cultures throughout history. In prehistoric times, societal structures were largely determined by the needs of survival. The concept of marriage, as we understand it today, did not exist. Instead, relationships were formed based on the need for making children and the division of labor. It is believed that polygamy, specifically polygyny, one man with multiple wives, was common during this era. The primary reason for this was the higher mortality rate among prehistoric men due to hunting and warfare. This resulted in a surplus of women, leading to the practice of polygyny. Additionally, having multiple wives allowed for increased fertility, a crucial factor in the survival of early human societies. However, it is important to note that this was not a universal practice. The societal structure varied greatly depending on geographical location and available resources. Moving forward in our exploration of polygamy in prehistoric times, we delve into the archaeological and genetic evidence that supports the popularity of this practice. One of the earliest indications of polygamy comes from the Paleolithic era, around 20,000 years ago. Fossil records from this period, particularly those found in the region of modern-day Russia, reveal a skewed gender ratio in adult remains, with significantly more females than males. This difference suggests a polygynous society, where one male mates with multiple females. Research on ancient DNA, such as the study conducted by Hammer et in 2008, indicates a higher variance in male reproductive success compared to females, which points to a polygynous mating system, where a small number of males mate with multiple females. Moving into the Neolithic era, around 10,000 years ago, the advent of agriculture led to significant changes in societal structures, including marital practices. For instance, some societies practice sororal polygyny, where a man marries multiple sisters, or fraternal polyandry, where a woman marries multiple brothers. Archaeological evidence from this period suggests a continuation of polygamy, but with some notable shifts. One such shift was the emergence of social layering. As societies transitioned from hunter-gatherer lifestyles to farming, wealth and resources became increasingly concentrated. This led to the emergence of powerful elites who could afford to have multiple wives. Evidence of this can be seen in burial sites, where high-status males are often found buried with multiple females. Another notable shift was the change in the nature of polygamy. While Paleolithic societies were predominantly polygynous, Neolithic societies showed evidence of both polygyny and polyandry, where one female has multiple male partners. This is suggested by archaeological findings in regions like ancient Tibet and Nepal, where burial sites indicate a woman being buried with multiple men. To be honest, ancient Tibet, a region known for its unique cultural practices, was very notable for its practice of polygamy. This societal norm, deeply rooted in the Tibetan culture, was prevalent during the Tubo dynasty from the 7th to 9th centuries. Polygamy was not only accepted, but was also encouraged as a means to establish alliances and strengthen familial ties. The most prominent example was the Tibetan king Songtsen Gampo, who had multiple wives, including Princess Wenching from the Tang dynasty of China and Princess Bhirakuti of Nepal. These marriages were strategic, designed to serve political alliances and promote peace. Diggings at Tibet burial sites have also revealed multiple wives buried alongside high-ranking males, indicating their polygamous marital status normality. Furthermore, ancient texts and scriptures, such as the Old Tibetan Chronicle and the Old Tibetan Annals, provide evidence of polygamy. These documents, dating back to the 7th century, contain records of marriages, divorces, and the societal norms surrounding these practices. Polyandry, where a woman has multiple husbands, was also common in Tibet, but for a very special reason. This was particularly common among the peasant class, where brothers would often share a wife to prevent the division of land and property. This practice was a solution to the challenges of land shortage and population control. The practice of polygamy in ancient Tibet began to decline with the spread of Buddhism in the region around the 7th century. Buddhism, with its emphasis on monogamy, gradually influenced societal norms and practices. However, the transition was not immediate, and polygamy continued for several centuries, particularly in rural areas. Despite the decline, remains of these ancient practices still exist in some remote regions of Tibet. These relics of a past era serve as a testament to the complex and diverse nature of ancient Tibetan society. Moving on to ancient Greece, where the practice of polygamy was not as common as in other ancient societies, yet it was not entirely absent either. It is important to note that ancient Greece was not a unified nation, but a collection of city-states, each with its own set of laws and customs. In most city-states, monogamy was the norm, but there were exceptions. For instance, in Sparta, a city-state known for its military strength and unique societal structure, polygamy was practiced to some extent. This was primarily due to the city's emphasis on producing strong warriors. If a man was unable to have children with his wife, he could take a second wife to ensure offspring. This led to the rise of polygamy in the city-state known for its legendary warriors. However, this was not polygamy in the traditional sense, as the first wife would still hold a higher status. In addition, Spartan society was also accepting of polyandria, and not just because they were a bit wild in the head. Spartan men were often away from home due to military campaigns, and the city-state's high mortality rate led to a shortage of men. As a result, it was not uncommon for a Spartan woman to have multiple husbands, as women held the responsibility of bearing children. And how does one bear children when there's no one there to plant the seed? This practice was a practical solution to the demographic imbalance. However, it's crucial to note that these practices were not the norm throughout ancient Greece. Each city-state had its own laws and customs, and what was acceptable in one might not be in another. For instance, in Thebes, another prominent city-state, monogamy was the standard, and polygamy was virtually unheard of. Thebes, unlike Sparta, did not face a severe gender imbalance and thus did not require such drastic measures. In other city-states, such as Athens, the practice was largely frowned upon. Athenian law dictated that a man could only have one legal wife, but concubines were common. The practice of keeping concubines was not considered polygamy, but it did blur the lines of monogamy. The wife, usually of the same social status as the man, was responsible for running the household and producing legitimate heirs. Concubines, on the other hand, were often slaves or metics, foreigners living in Athens. Their children were considered illegitimate and could not inherit their father's property. While the practice of polygamy was not widespread in ancient Greece, it was more common in the mythology of the period. The gods of the Greek pantheon were often portrayed as polygamous, with Zeus, the king of the gods, being the most legendary example. Zeus had numerous lovers, both mortal and divine, and fathered many children. These mythological narratives may have influenced societal norms, but they did not directly translate into everyday practice. The gods were seen as beings who operated outside the moral and social constraints that governed human behavior. Therefore, their actions, including their marital arrangements, were not meant to be copied by mortals. In the realm of mortals, marriage in ancient Greece was primarily a social and economic contract rather than a romantic union. Men married to secure legitimate heirs and to forge alliances with other families. In this context, polygamy would have been impractical, as it would have complicated inheritance issues and potentially led to conflicts between co-wives. It's worth noting that in all of these cases from ancient Greece, where they did practice polygamy, the primary motivation was not sexual, but rather social and economic. But I bet they enjoyed it nonetheless. And now, the exact opposite of the fun land they call Sparta and ancient Greece, I present to you the ancient Rome, where everyone has only one wife and no extra fun is allowed. Okay, a bit of fun is still allowed. Polygamy was not a common or socially accepted practice in ancient Rome. The Romans, in fact, were monogamous, a practice that distinguished them from other ancient civilizations. The Roman law of marriage, matrimonium, was based on the idea of a union between one man and one woman. The concept of polygamy was alien to their societal norms and legal systems. The Roman marriage was a private contract between two families, not just the individuals getting married. It was a strategic alliance for political, social, or economic reasons. The woman would leave her father's authority, patria potestas, and come under the control of her husband or his father. The husband had the right to divorce his wife for various reasons, including infertility, adultery, or even for drinking wine, which was considered a serious offense. Women drinking wine was frowned upon and socially unacceptable, especially for married women. It was seen as a sign of looseness and immorality, but was more acceptable for widows and older women. In ancient Rome, marriage was seen as a duty to the state, with the primary purpose being to produce legitimate children who could inherit property and continue the family line. The importance of monogamy was so ingrained in Roman society that Augustus, the first Roman emperor, introduced laws to encourage marriage and penalize those who remained unmarried or childless. Despite the strict monogamous principles of Roman society, there were instances of de facto polygamy. This was not through multiple legal marriages, but rather through the practice of maintaining palake, something similar to Greeks' concubines. This relationship was socially acceptable and even regulated by law, being not considered adultery, as it was a lower status form of partnership. The children of a concubine were not considered legitimate heirs, but they were not stigmatized either. They were given the status of natural children and could be legitimized by their father if he chose to do so. This practice allowed Roman men, particularly those of high status, to have multiple sexual partners while still maintaining the societal norms of monogamy. It was a way to avoid the strict laws of marriage without facing social or legal reaction. Despite the use of palake, the Roman society held monogamy as the ideal. This was reflected in their mythology and literature. The story of Penelope, who faithfully waited for her husband Odysseus to return from the Trojan War, was a popular example of Roman virtue. Similarly, the tale of Lucretia, who chose to end her life rather than live with the dishonor of rape, was seen as a testament to the Roman values of chastity and loyalty. The Romans also had strict laws against adultery. The Lex Julia de Adulteriis, a law code enacted by Augustus in 18 BC, made adultery a public crime for the first time. The law was primarily aimed at preserving the sanctity of the Roman family and protecting the rights of husbands. It allowed them to kill their wives or their wives' lovers if caught in the act. And now, moving far east, where Asia has a long and complex history, with its roots deeply embedded in the cultural, religious, and social fabrics of several societies. In ancient China, for example, polygamy was widely accepted and practiced, particularly among the elite. Emperors and nobles often had multiple wives and concubines, a practice that was not only a symbol of status and power, but also a means to ensure the continuity of their lineage. In the 6th century BC, during the Zhou dynasty, the rites of Zhou even codified the number of wives and concubines a man could have based on his rank. Emperors were allowed to have one empress and numerous concubines, while a duke could have one wife and two concubines, and a gentleman just one wife. Concurrently, in India, the practice of polygamy was also prevalent. The ancient Hindu scriptures, the Vedas, sanctioned polygamy, particularly for Kshatriyas, the warrior caste. This was largely due to the high mortality rate among men who fought in wars, leading to a significant gender imbalance in society. The practice of polygamy in pre-modern Japan was a phenomenon largely confined to the samurai class, and was one of the most interesting forms of polygamy throughout history. The samurai, a military nobility that rose to height in the 12th century, were known for their martial talent and strict loyalty to the Bushido code. However, their domestic lives were characterized by a complex system of marriage that often involved multiple wives. This system, known as yomeri, was not merely a matter of personal preference, but a strategic tool used to cement alliances, consolidate power, and ensure the continuity of family lines. The primary wife, or seishitsu, was usually of equal or higher social status than the husband, and her main role was to produce a male heir. The secondary wives, or sokushitsu, were often from lower-ranking families and were considered part of the husband's household. These marriages were typically arranged by the families involved, with the consent of the wife's parents being a crucial factor. Despite the apparent inequality, the system of yomeri provided certain benefits for the wives involved. The primary wife held a position of considerable authority within the household, while the secondary wives could expect a certain degree of financial security and social status. The children of these marriages, regardless of their mother's status, were considered legitimate and could potentially inherit their father's position. This system of polygamy was not without its challenges, however, and conflicts between wives were not uncommon. However, the practice of yomeri began to decline with the advent of the Edo period in the 17th century. The Tokugawa shogunate, which ruled Japan during this time, implemented a series of reforms aimed at stabilizing the country and centralizing its power. One of these reforms was the prohibition of polygamy among the samurai class. The Tokugawa shogunate sought to distinguish itself from the chaotic Sengoku period, and the prohibition of polygamy was part of a broader effort to promote social order and moral rectitude. Despite this prohibition, however, the practice of yomeri did not disappear entirely, and it continued to be practiced in some form throughout the Edo period. The Mongol Empire, which spanned a significant part of Asia in the 13th and 14th centuries, also saw the practice of polygamy and even saw the rise of the most famous ladies' man throughout history, if I may say so, the Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, whose birth name was Temujin, born around 1162, was the founder and first great Khan of the Mongol Empire, which became the largest empire in history after his death. His life was marked by a chain of conquests and, interestingly, a large number of wives and children. It is rumored that Genghis Khan had numerous ovulating women brought to his bedroom every night. Considering that his reign lasted for 21 years, you do the math of how many children he might have had. It's said that every 8th person on Earth is related to him in this day and age. Thus, the practice of polygamy in Asia has evolved significantly over the centuries, shaped by cultural, religious, and socio-economic factors. Today, it is largely a relic of the past, although it continues to exist in some societies. Moving back to Europe, in ancient Estonia, societal norms and customs were distinctively different from what we see today. The roots of polygamy in ancient Estonia can be traced back to the 1st century AD, a time when the region was populated by various Finno-Ugric tribes. The societal structure was mainly patriarchal, with men holding the majority of power and influence. This structure extended to family life, where a man could have multiple wives. Polygamy was seen as a sign of wealth and status, as only men with substantial resources could afford to maintain multiple households. The practice was not limited to the elite, however. Even men of modest means could have multiple wives if they could provide for them. The wives, in turn, were expected to contribute to the family's well-being through household chores and child rearing. The practice of polygamy was intertwined with the belief systems of the time. The ancient Estonians practiced a form of animism, venerating natural elements and ancestral spirits. It was believed that having multiple wives increased a man's spiritual power, enhancing his standing in the community and his relationship with the spirit world. The transition from polygamy to monogamy in Estonia was a gradual process, influenced by several factors. The most significant was the Christianization of Estonia in the 13th century. The Teutonic Knights, a Catholic military order, launched a series of crusades in the Baltic region, including Estonia. Their goal was to convert the pagan tribes to Christianity, which included the imposition of Christian marital norms. The Christian doctrine of monogamy was at odds with the established practice of polygamy, leading to a cultural clash. Over time, however, the influence of the church began to take over Estonian society. The Christian clergy actively discouraged polygamy, promoting monogamy as the only acceptable form of marriage. By the late Middle Ages, polygamy had become a marginal practice in Estonia, restricted to remote areas and minority groups. Monogamy had thus become the norm. Hopping onto another continent, in pre-Columbian civilizations of the Americas, polygamy was and is a thrilling subject. Among the Aztecs, a Mesoamerican culture that flourished in central Mexico from 1300 to 1521, polygamy was not only acceptable, but was also a sign of wealth and status. Aztec men, particularly nobles and warriors, often had several wives. However, the first wife held a superior position, and her children were given preference in matters of inheritance. Moving further north, the indigenous societies of the Great Plains, such as the Sioux and Cheyenne, also practiced polygamy. The harsh environment and nomadic lifestyle of these tribes made multiple wives advantageous, as they could contribute to the family's survival by performing various tasks such as gathering food, making clothing, and caring for children. In the Inca Empire, located in the Andes region of South America, polygamy was also practiced, especially among the nobility. The Sapa Inca, the emperor, often had many wives, some of whom were his own sisters, to ensure the purity of the royal bloodline. However, like the Aztecs, the Incas also recognized a primary wife, often referred to as the principal wife or queen, whose offspring were given preference in the line of succession. However, it's important to note that polygamy was not universally practiced across all pre-Columbian societies. Some tribes, particularly those in the northeastern woodlands and the southeastern United States, practiced monogamy. Despite the popularity of polygamy in many societies, these tribes valued the bond between one man and one woman, with divorce usually being a rare occurrence. There are also examples from South America, where only men of worthy age could have multiple children, while the young men must wait for their time, having only one wife meanwhile. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas brought significant changes to the practice of polygamy in pre-Columbian societies. The Europeans, with their predominantly Christian and monogamous beliefs, viewed polygamy as a sinful practice and sought to eradicate it. In the Spanish colonies, for instance, the Catholic Church played a significant role in suppressing polygamy. The Church's missionaries often refused to baptize the children of polygamous unions, which put significant pressure on indigenous societies to abandon the practice. In the English colonies, The Puritans, who held strict views on marriage and family, also sought to suppress polygamy. They passed laws prohibiting the practice and imposed severe punishments on those who violated them. Despite these efforts, polygamy persisted in some indigenous societies, particularly in remote and isolated areas. However, by the late 19th century, the practice had largely disappeared, a victim of European cultural and religious imperialism. The history of polygamy in pre-Columbian societies provides a fascinating glimpse into the diverse cultural practices that existed in the Americas before the arrival of Europeans. It also underscores the profound impact that European colonization had on indigenous cultures and societies. In the vast, icy expanse of Siberia, a unique societal structure existed among the indigenous tribes, particularly with the shamans, spiritual intermediaries between the human and spirit world. Polygamy, specifically polygyny, the practice of having multiple wives, was a common practice. The roots of this tradition can be traced back to the prehistoric times of Siberia, with the earliest recorded instances dating back to the 13th century. The shamans, revered for their spiritual prowess, often had multiple wives. This practice was not merely a social norm, but was deeply intertwined with their spiritual beliefs and practices. Each wife a shaman married was believed to bring with her a unique spirit helper, known as an ayami. These spirit helpers were considered essential for the shaman's spiritual work, providing guidance, protection, and assistance in the spirit world. The ayami were believed to be powerful spirits, capable of transforming into animals, humans, or even inanimate objects. They were considered the source of the shaman's supernatural powers, enabling them to heal, predict the future, and communicate with the spirit world. The more ayami a shaman had, the more powerful they were considered to be. Therefore, having multiple wives was seen as a means of accumulating more ayami and consequently more spiritual power. The wives of shamans were not merely passive participants in this arrangement. They were often powerful spiritual practitioners in their own right, performing rituals, interpreting dreams, and even acting as mediums for the ayami. Their roles were integral to the spiritual and societal functioning of these Siberian tribes. The wives, in addition to their spiritual roles, also played vital roles in the day-to-day functioning of the household. They were responsible for the preparation of ritual objects, maintaining the sacred space of the shaman, and assisting in the performance of rituals. The wives also played a crucial role in the transmission of shamanic knowledge, passing it down to the next generation. The practice of polygyny among Siberian shamans was not without its challenges. Disputes and conflicts among wives were not uncommon. However, these were typically resolved within the family structure, with the shaman acting as the mediator. The shaman's authority, both spiritual and societal, was crucial in maintaining harmony within the household. From the 17th century onwards, Russian colonization brought Orthodox Christianity to Siberia, leading to a clash of cultures and religious beliefs. The Russian authorities often viewed the shamans and their practices with suspicion and hostility, leading to a gradual decline of shamanism and its associated practices, including polygyny. Despite these pressures, shamanism and its traditions managed to survive in certain remote areas of Siberia. The practice of shamans having multiple wives, however, became increasingly rare. Today, while polygyny is no longer a common practice, the legacy of this unique societal structure can still be seen in the rich tapestry of Siberian culture and history. And before we hop on to modern times, let's quickly see how Africa has adopted polygamy and faces the difficulties and joys accompanied with it. In many African societies, polygamy was not merely a marital arrangement, but a complex social system. It was a means of forging alliances, consolidating power, and ensuring the continuity of the lineage. The number of wives a man had often reflected his social status, with the wealthy and powerful often having multiple wives. The practice was also tied to economic factors. In agrarian societies, having multiple wives could mean more hands to work the land, leading to increased productivity and wealth. In pastoral societies, polygamy was often linked to the number of livestock a man owned, as wives and children could help in herding and managing the animals. The arrival of European colonizers in the 19th and 20th centuries brought significant changes to the practice of polygamy in Africa. The colonizers, driven by their own cultural and religious beliefs, sought to suppress polygamy, viewing it as a barbaric and uncivilized practice. They introduced laws and policies aimed at discouraging and, in some cases, outright banning the practice. These efforts, however, met with resistance from many African societies who saw polygamy as an integral part of their culture and tradition. Despite the pressure from the colonizers, the practice persisted in many parts of the continent. In the post-colonial era, the the status of polygamy in Africa has remained complex and contentious. While some African countries have outlawed the practice, others have legalized it under certain conditions. For instance, in countries like South Africa and Kenya, polygamy is legal, but it is subject to certain restrictions and regulations. In contemporary Africa, the practice of polygamy is influenced by a variety of factors. Religion plays a significant role, with Islam being the most prominent religion that permits polygamy. In countries with a substantial Muslim population, such as Niger and Senegal, polygamy is quite prevalent. However, Islamic law stipulates that a man must treat all wives equally, a condition that can be challenging to fulfill, thus limiting the number of polygamous unions. Economic factors also influence the practice of polygamy. In some societies, the bride price, a sum of money or goods given by the groom's family to the bride's family, can be prohibitive, making polygamy a luxury only the wealthy can afford. Conversely, in societies where bride price is low or non-existent, polygamy can be more common. The impact of HIV/AIDS has also affected the practice of polygamy in Africa. The fear of infection has led some men to reconsider having multiple wives, and some societies now discourage the practice as a means of controlling the spread of the virus. Today, the Maasai tribe still holds a very interesting tradition, where a man can have multiple wives, 15 for example, and every available single man can also have sexual relations with any of the wives. All the children born from this act are still considered to be the main husband's children. And you thought you'd heard everything. In the 21st century, polygamy remains legal in 58 out of nearly 200 sovereign countries, the vast majority of them being African countries. Notable exceptions include India and Indonesia, where it is legal in certain forms. In India, for example, polygamy is legal for Muslims under the Muslim personal law. In the United States, polygamy is illegal in all 50 states, as well as the District of Columbia. However, enforcement of these laws varies, and there are known communities that practice polygamy in states like Utah and Arizona. This is often due to religious beliefs, as some sects interpret certain religious texts as endorsing polygamy. In Europe, polygamy is generally illegal, with some exceptions for recognized religious communities. For instance, in the United Kingdom, while polygamy is not legally recognized, it is not a criminal offense, and multiple religious marriages may be recognized for welfare benefits. In terms of societal attitudes, polygamy is generally viewed negatively in Western societies. However, there are exceptions, and attitudes can vary widely. For example, a 2016 poll found that 17% of Americans found polygamy morally acceptable, up from 7% in 2003. I seriously hope you enjoyed these 20 or something minutes, because unlike some of our commentators think, making these videos is not a press of a button, but we enjoy every second of the process. Be sure to watch our other videos as well, which should appear on the screen just about now. You can only see 2, but there are plenty more on our YouTube channel page. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and go surprise your imaginary friends with some new facts you just learned. History, but fast.